The election's over. It was a pretty incredible U.S. presidential election, even for somebody like me who was looking at it from European perspective. But what was said in the presidential election campaign is definitely not necessarily what's going to happen when Trump is the president. First of all, Trump never expected to be elected. I mean, that's obvious in the last week or so when he's been kind of running around looking for ideas and policies. Secondly, the U.S. media is already talking about him reneging on most of the things he talked about during the election campaign, including the so-called wall that the Mexicans were supposed to be paying for, deportation of 11 million illegal immigrants, etc., etc. Trump is a narcissistic fake. He's not interested in the common man that he kind of campaign on behalf of those people who have been left behind by globalization and the closing of the old industry, steel, iron, steel, coal, etc. He's not interested in that. He's interested in himself. He's an egoistic megalomaniac and a narcissist. So I don't think he's ever even had an interest in implementing the kind of things that he talked about during his election campaign. And if that's as true on domestic stroke foreign policy, because immigration is both, then it's also going to be true in the realm of foreign policy. His chief of staff is a member of the Republican establishment. That means he's going to espouse the traditional Republican view of Putin and the Russian regime, which is highly negative. We should also bear in mind that Obama was not great for Ukraine. It wasn't great for international relations in general, because he was very perceived, and Trump here was correct. Obama was perceived as extremely weak throughout the world. So we went from a person perceived as a cowboy, Bush Jr., to somebody who's perceived as extremely weak and unwilling to basically get involved. And of course, one of the best examples of that is the so-called red lines in Syria, which allowed and gave an ability for Russia to come in. Russia loves vacuums. Russia loves power vacuums that Obama created because it can throw its weight about. You know, in reality, Russia cannot take on the US. But when there's a power vacuum, that's what Putin's been doing the last few years. So I don't believe he's going to implement most of what he said during his election campaign because he's an opportunist. I don't think he's sincere. I don't think he believes in most of the things that he said. They were just things to say to get elected. He's going to be constrained by the people who are around him, particularly the Republicans in the U.S. Congress and his chief of staff. And he's going to be constrained by realities on the ground in the foreign policy arena. So if anything, Trump is going to be a continuation of Obama. It's not going to be that much different. On the question of sending a military equipment to Ukraine, how is Trump going to be different to Obama? Obama vetoed the sending of military equipment to Ukraine because he said we had to let the Minsk process prove itself. The Minsk process was always a joke. Everybody understood that. There's always a convenient way for the West to not deal with the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and is undertaking aggression against Ukraine. It was a fig leaf. Because during the Minsk process, between Minsk I and Minsk II, Russia built up the separatist forces into a formidable army and continued to send military equipment in there. And if you think that European and US intelligence services didn't know that, then you've been to too many Dutch coffee shops. So Trump is not going to be that much different on the question of sending military equipment. Now, on the question of Crimea, well, Crimea, yes. Trump said some pretty dumb things during the election campaign. That's true. But it's not Trump that decides on legal questions about the Crimea. This is down to international organizations like the UN. International Criminal Court ruled just this very week that what's going on in eastern Ukraine and in the Crimea constitutes a war between both countries, and then what has taken place in the Crimea is Russia's occupation, illegal occupation. So it's international legal organizations, international institutions, EU, OSCE, Council of Europe, UN. These are the organizations that will decide on these kind of questions. Now, the Crimea is complicated. Why? Because Ukrainians have fought for the Donbas. They haven't fought for the Crimea. They didn't fight for the Crimea in 2014, and they haven't fought for the Crimea since then. Ukraine in government and Ukrainian nationalist groups, separate from the government, have not sent in partisan groups, terrorist groups, which they would have every right to in an area that's been occupied. Nobody's done that. Not a single example of Ukrainian military activity vis-a-vis the Crimea. Now, you might say, what do you expect? We don't want to provoke Russia and it invades Ukraine from the south. Maybe that's the case. Maybe, Ukraine doesn't want a war on too many fronts. But, you're not going to get sympathy in the outside world if you're not willing to fight for the territory yourself. The Crimea also, and this is a question to President Poroshenko, who negotiated Minsk I and Minsk II. Why is the Crimea not in Minsk negotiations? It's not even part of it. It's only the Minsk negotiations, Minsk agreements only apply to the Donbas, not to the Crimea. So I don't believe that the West, despite Trump's rhetoric, and he didn't even know what was really going on in the Crimea or what Russia was doing in Ukraine, which that's not that unusual with American politicians. I mean, did Bush Jr. know that much about the outside world? But it's not going to be. It's not. The West will continue to not officially recognize Russia's annexation of the Crimea. I don't think that Europeans can step back from that because those sanctions will remain in place. But and so here, President Trump, will be unable, despite any rhetoric, to change that legal position. But of course, the West did not recognize, and a good example here, and a good comparison here, the West did not recognize the 3 Baltic states as being part of the Soviet Union for over 50 years. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union controlled those 3 countries. And many people would argue that could be a similar question on the Crimea, that legally outside world would not recognize Russia's incorporation, but down the road we'll see what happens, in terms of whether the Crimea will eventually, maybe in a post-Putin democratic Russia, maybe it will go back to Ukraine. The problem with the Crimea is that it's very different to the Donbas. It's very different for 2 reasons. And this is where I don't think Trump will affect this. Firstly, Ukrainians are not being willing to fight for it. Even Ukrainian nationalists in Kyiv that I've talked to say they are not interested in really fighting for the Crimea. And the Ukrainian government has continued. How do you explain this? Ukrainian government has continued to supply fresh water and energy to the Crimea, which has a deficit in both of those areas. And that led to, remember, the boycotts and the blockades created by Ukrainian nationalists and Crimean Tatars in 2015. Why was the Ukrainian government sending these 2 resources to an area occupied by foreign power? And it's also different, the Crimea, because majority of Russians, including democratic Russians, like, for example, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oligarch who was imprisoned by Putin, they support Russia's annexation. So it's not just Putin supporting it. It's also the democratic camp in Russia supports that. Now, democratic Russians and Ukrainians have a different view of the Donbas. Democratic Russians there don't support Russia's invasion of the Donbas. They think that's wrong. So there, Putin has to be more careful. And of course, Ukrainians of all political persuasions, including nationalists and patriots and others, and many Russian speakers, have been willing to fight and die for the Donbas. And in fact, they gave Russia a bloody nose. So, that kind of reality on the ground will not change that much. because the person who can really stop the war in eastern Ukraine is Putin. And I don't think he will. It won't be Trump. It will be Putin. And unfortunately, Putin will be Russian president for as long as he lives. So I think we have to, forget in some ways Trump's election rhetoric. He's reneging on most of it already, and he'll probably renege on that vis-a-vis Ukraine. Trump cannot do all these things alone. The U.S. State Department, the Democrats and Republicans in both houses of the U.S. Congress will be very opposed to him implementing this kind of pro-Putin rhetoric that he talked about on the election campaign. And so will NATO. Trump has already backpedaled on NATO membership and on NATO questions. So, we have to look at this in a very kind of rational light. And compared to Obama, he's going to be basically the same, except he's going to be, I think, probably tougher with Putin, maybe down the road, because relations inevitably will deteriorate than is the case with Obama, who basically, always turned the other cheek. To give one little example and final example, it is unprecedented. During this presidential election campaign in the U.S., Russia openly intervened with the hacking and the releasing of emails and this, that, and the other. This may have tipped the balance for Trump. Some people are arguing this could have been certainly the case. And this is Putin's revenge for America supporting democratic change and regime change in Russia's neighborhood. This is Putin's revenge for that. Obama did nothing in retaliation. Absolutely nothing. Which sends a signal to Putin that he's a weakling. If Trump had been president, would he have done nothing? Or would he have been in the middle of the night tweeting away and been extremely angry that who the hell is this guy doing this to me? So there are many of these kind of nuances that we have to take into effect. Obama was not great in Ukraine. He was the only president that never went to Ukraine since 1991. Bush Sr. traveled to Kyiv, Bush Jr. did, and Bill Clinton did. Obama never did that. Why? Was he a really good friend of Ukraine? I'm not so sure.